no longer on mute.
Okay, you're on mute now?
I'm not.
Okay, perfect. So
Right.
we're live. Okay, so
Yeah.
we'll be now.
Okay.
Okay, well, thank you all for coming today on this nice, wet, raining Friday. I just heard that Seattle broke the world our record for the wettest winter on record. So, yeah, that's awesome. Really cool, isn't it? But I'm glad that we stay warm and dry together and hopefully have some good food and good presentation. So, so today we are here with Eric, and Eric's going to talk about the world of PR and what does that mean for customers, and what do you do with talking about your startup and talking about your brand. So, without further ado, we'll let Eric start this off.
All right. Thanks, Elizabeth.
Oh, do you have a clicker?
I have a clicker right there.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. So we instantly have a group decision to make, which is, can you hear me in back? If you can, then we don't need a microphone. If you can't, then we need a microphone. Thumbs up and back? We got an okay and a thumbs up. 2, 3, 4 thumbs up. All right, we're already in motion. My name's Eric Schudiske. I'm going to give you a brief introduction. We're going to learn some vocabulary words. We're going to ideally give you a tool set for how you can enrich your brand, acquire customers, and raise awareness of your issue and idea. And I wanted to start with who I am, give you a little idea of where this is coming from. So I grew up in TV news. I was a reporter across the United States for about 10 years. Ended here in Seattle at the ABC and NBC affiliates. I moved into global PR, spent 5 years with a tech company, and then moved most recently to Gallatin Public Affairs. So there's the background, and now I want to give you the why you're here, ideally, and why I have 2 colleagues in back, Anna Boone and Bruce Graneski, and we love being in rooms like this, not just because they're tastefully appointed and the color scheme is really good, but because people in this room have ideas, and they're not afraid to share those ideas and stand on a pedestal and make their voice heard. And we know if you do that, you can change ideas, you can influence people, and you can make lives better. And we know through our practice that we can give people a taller pedestal, point them in the right direction, and put the right people in front of them. And that's the power we believe is encumbered in PR and helps build brands and customer acquisition. So that is ideally why we're here. We want to raise your pedestal up, and we're going to give you a tool set for how you can do that and run through some definitions. So what I want to lay down as a little bit of a scene setter and use the clicker for the first time is just like, what are some of the definitions? What world are we playing in, and what informs this conversation? And it will eventually be a conversation once the Q&A starts. So communications, public relations, and public affairs. We're in a public affairs firm. This means there's really 3 areas in which we practice. The communications, and I'll use this interchangeably with public relations, but think of communications as your entire platform. This is how you talk to customers. This is how you manage crisis communications. This is how you work on your branding, your value prop. This is all how you talk to people who may consume your product, or who may enrich your idea, who may become advocates for you in the future. And then we work very closely in government relations. Many of our clients are folks who are in the regulatory space, so we worked and helped them navigate that space. And then we offer workshops. So this is a way in which we can kind of take bite-sized chunks of all of that. And what I'm very proud of, and I think each of you standing on your pedestals should be proud of as well, is that you're advocates. You're advocates for an idea. And we work with some really wonderful ideas out there, including one called SaveTheInventor.org, which is about IP, intellectual property. And we can talk about that offline, but involves everyone who's invented or has IP. You'll learn a vocab word, and this is your vocab word today. Synesthesia. I thought, we're in an academic setting, let's learn a little bit. Synesthesia, for those who might not be aware, is the idea that our senses are not independent of themselves. So your taste, your hearing, your sight aren't these siloed properties, but rather interact. And this is where we get these phrases in our language like bitter cold, or that color's really loud. There's that interplay. And when you think of synesthesia, think of communications in your business as well, because it is also not a siloed property. is also something that interacts with each of your business units to enrich your vision. So you have this interplay. So how many people had heard that word before? Gah! Oh, I thought I was dropping a decent one. Okay, so everyone else, there's your word of the day. They also say that you should have a quote in your presentation. So this is the why should we enrich ourselves with a broader understanding of communication. Grover Cleveland, who's a fascinating individual, is reported to have said, tech and biomed startups offer the greatest potential for positive societal change with often the least ability to articulate that change. #truth. So what they didn't say is your quote should be factual. So while Grover Cleveland didn't believe that or didn't say that, it's an idea and concept that plays very heavily in the media. So I most recently had a conversation with Todd Bishop, and he's the co-founder of this website called GeekWire. And this is how I introduced him in a speech, because the media is really good at distilling these properties that are difficult for people who are inside this echo chamber of ideas to capture. You know, what is the value to the masses for your project? And an outside communicator has that vision and can help distill that, and journalists are wonderful at that. There is one quote that is true that I'd like to present to the crowd, and it's from another Seattle gentleman named Bill Gates, who said, and it's a hyper improbable scenario, but he said that if I were down to my last dollar, which won't happen, I'd spend that on PR. So it's his recognition that public relations and communications is essential to maintain the identity of your company. Whoop. So we have to have a definition slide. The definition slide, so communications as a broader principle. You want to manage the image and reputation of your company. There are 3 companies up on this board, actually 4, and if CoMotion is a company, we have 5. So, but 3 that I want you to focus on now. So Disney, Apple, and Google. We do some business with Google as part of our portfolio. Combined, they have a valuation of more than $1 trillion, those 3 companies. They also are in the top 5 of companies with the highest reputation in the world. You'll notice a 4th company on this slide in the lower left, Comcast. Comcast has a horrible reputation, the bottom 5, but also has a pretty significant valuation. So you have to decide for your company, which side do I want to be on? What's the value of my reputation? So you should be asking yourself a few questions right now, ideally. So what do I need in my communications tool set? What buttons can I press to affect some sort of change? What's my minimum viable product? You know, what's the least I can check off my list and know that I'm doing something? And how do I execute on my communications checklist? So shockingly, we're going to answer those 3 questions through the course of this presentation. So the buttons that you have to press are 4. 3, and then maybe a secondary button. But you have paid. So these are the forms of media in which we know we can operate and are fluent in. So you have advertising, and there are companies that do this exceptionally well to affect their reputational status. Apple is exceptional at this. They do something that no other company does, which is run 90-second commercials with almost no audio. Not no audio, no transcripts, very few words. And they affect their brand. Earned media, and this is where I have my area of expertise in my practice, parlaying owned media into earned, having grown up in the television news world. Earned is capturing a news story. How can you reel that in? And we'll talk about some ways in which you might be able to do that. And then owned. You know, this is what you have already in this room. And everyone here has 2, maybe 3 of 4 ideal ingredients to produce your own story to help bring in news coverage. And we'll talk about why does that matter too. I mean, it's great to get headlines, but it's not great if it doesn't accomplish a strategic goal. So to have that strategic goal in mind as well. So owned is the best way to start on your track of producing some sort of media impression and reaching your strategic goal. And then shared kind of runs across all 4. And this is the amplification of your message. This is where someone sees your story on Medium or on your blog and shares it via their social accounts. So there's an image I stole off the internet of a footprint and your media footprint. So this will be rudimentary, but this will be a very basic question.
I was going to ask if you can move about 4 feet that way.
I can move about 4 feet this way. Okay, now I'm locked in. All right, so your media footprint. Now this will be very high level, and everyone here will have a different approach, but this is a guideline, not a rule. And I just read today, and I'm not sure if anyone else saw this, the one trait that made Bill Gates hyper successful, according to a recent study, is that he challenged the rules. So definitely challenge what you see and what you hear, because your situation will be different. So if you're producing for a customer, kind of your buy-in would be 3 platforms: Facebook, Twitter, a company blog. If you're producing for a business, you're going to have a different portfolio that we typically recommend, which would be LinkedIn, Medium, and blog. Are folks here familiar with Medium? Yeah. More people are familiar with Synesthesia than Medium? Okay, all right, good. All right, I'm bringing something to the conversation. Medium is a website where you can self-publish without an editor, and it has great traction, and it's generally geared towards tech and science. So you can write a paper, put it on Medium, and then share that link. And you have, it's a great way to have this kind of, we call it borrowed credibility, but to produce borrowed credibility. You're kind of you're already on the site, you're already published, and then you can use mechanisms to link back to that. Share it with customers, share it with your sphere of influencers. So Medium is a great place to kind of have that initial buy-in, and then producing a blog as well. So here's your checklist and your 3 to-dos, and we work with customers on this, and it'll sound simple, it's not simple, and I feel as though, trying to keep 4 feet right, this is our area of practice, and I feel a little negligent just kind of giving the keys to a Ferrari and going, all right, you're on a test track, go get them. So we're here as resources, so if you have questions, our email addresses will be on the back end of this as well. So lock in your value proposition and brand. So very quickly, value proposition, who you are, why does it matter? Brand, how you look, how you talk. And I've done rebranding exercises for a global tech company, and we went down to the granular level of how are customer service tickets answered. What words do we use on social media, and what words don't we use? There's that level of texture to these plans. So as we saw before, and hopefully you're empowered to perform, is, what's your social footprint? How can you produce a footprint, but even more importantly than that is how can you produce a social footprint where you can create and maintain a content stream? A Facebook page that hasn't been updated in 3 months isn't a positive representation of your presence. So you want to make sure that you build in kind of this workload to that process. So create and maintain a content stream. And, okay, good. So we're going to have some cautionary tales a little bit later, including the cautionary tale, the letter S, which sounds very Sesame Street, but it's true. So it'll help kind of put some bumpers, some guideposts on how you kind of produce that content stream. So create and maintain a content stream. And that's what I did professionally for years. So we do this with our clients as well. Take yourself through a headline writing exercise. What's the headline that you want to appear in a publication? And you have, everyone in this room, which I alluded to, you kind of have 4 ways in which you already are sitting on a headline that people want to read about and would grow your social presence, would grow your visibility, and would allow you to raise that pedestal so you can increase the influence that you have in your sector. So your startup story. So how are you going to raise money? What's the video that you're going to produce on Indiegogo or Kickstarter that's going to raise $50,000 in a day? How can you manipulate that space to give yourself an edge? What's your funding stream? We talked about GeekWire quite a bit, but 1 out of every 3, 1 out of every 4 stories in GeekWire is about a funding raise. You know, who's on Series A, who had the latest valuation. So this is something we know works as far as attracting media. And we've seen this quite a bit, but if you produce, and you may already have this in a shelf somewhere, on your site somewhere, a tool that you can share publicly that offers value. Zillow is excellent at this. They produce Zestimate, which is a large, not a large, but a significant part of how they present themselves and their sphere of influence in how their reputation is perceived, because they offer this useful tool to customers. And then it also allows them a way to open a conversation with media. So you want to, and Anna's in the back, and she's done work with Uber much more, actually all more than I have. And they're a client that we've worked with, and this is a tactic that we've used in that case, but building an evangelist network, people that are fans of your product, of your idea, of your service, and empowering them to affect change. You have, if you build it right, a fire hose you can direct at public influencers, at the legislature, at City Hall, and using that is a discretionary decision, because it's not an endless well. So there's a tactic and approach there. And then we are in a large PhD per capita room. So what is your expertise? And this is a technique that takes some kind of quick twitch muscle memory. So you see a story that you know you can contribute to in a very special and unique way. There's nothing stopping you from contacting a reporter to produce yourself as someone who can contribute to the next evolution of that story. And in the process, raise your brand awareness and make sure there's all these mechanisms which we can put into play, but make sure they interview you in your office, at your desk, with your company logo. So be mindful that you are your own asset. So I believe that in this room, hopefully some ideas are beginning to percolate about how you can affect change and enhance your reputation and raise your awareness. So here's a cautionary tale of the letter S. So before you launch into the world, the letter S is going to be important. News is always new, typically. So use that as a guidepost for your headline writing exercise. What is new in this equation? And the difference between scrappy and crappy is 1 letter. So be very mindful that DIY is great, do it with you, might be better, do it for you, might be best. So tap into areas of expertise and your network when possible. So here's one play from the playbook that I'd like to offer up as a DIY potential. So you've had your headline writing exercise, you know your area of expertise, you write your story, you post it on Medium, it's new, it's not old, it's scrappy, it's not crappy, and you get 14 unique views. Your family is super excited about that post. You use that as bait to begin to fish for local media. You have contacts, or you can find email addresses, or you know people. Reach out and pitch that story. And there's, of course, ways in which that is done, and we're here as a resource for that. And then you bump up. You catch a bigger fish. GeekWire has 20 million unique views per month. But there are sites like Wired, which have 28 million. And media begets media. So you produce media, you have a greater chance and larger reputational cachet to pull from, to produce media. And then there's this ecosystem of effect. So you take media stories that you've earned and you make sure that you post about them. You put the banner of whatever news article or news medium has produced your piece, and you put that on your site. That's the borrowed credibility post part. And then you keep that cycle moving. What could go wrong with that? I mean, that sounds so great. So you might take a few quotes from this. You might take Grover Cleveland's quote. You might take Bill Clinton's quote. here's a quote you should probably take in earnest. Typically, in most situations, don't have Charlie Sheen as your spokesperson. So, you know, pharmaceuticals, put Charlie Sheen on stage, what could go wrong? We understand what can go wrong. And this was produced locally, but you have a great startup story. You've produced a ton of first-run equity. Then you change your funding model. And this happened to Swan Love, which had a great story, if you're not familiar. They promised to give newlyweds $10,000, and it was theirs to keep as long as they didn't get divorced. There was so much interest that they had to change their funding model, so it became crowdsourced. And this is their headline. And of course, Comcast can't win. People want to stream Bones, and they can't do it fast enough. So Comcast also not a winner. But what can go right? So these are some headlines that we've worked on. So Buber, produce an evangelist network, power that network to affect legislative change. There's another I talked about. There are two companies, Zitgo and Airing, which use pretty unique intellectual property and have raised money. Airing, which is this gentleman with this thing on his nose, is an answer to the clumsy CPAP machine, which is fascinating. And they're able to raise a ton of money and gather these headlines because their product's great, but there's a lot of great products that do not raise headlines. So they're smart and purposeful and strategic as far as their launch. Facebook, which is a company we work with down in Oregon, is getting headlines for data centers, which is work we do. And then Zitgo raised $50,000 in a day. Zitgo is like a smartwatch, but it tracks your posture. So interesting, but also that allows them to raise the next $50,000. Buzz begets buzz. So what? Why would that matter? So back to the beginning with the pedestal. The taller the pedestal, the more you're focused in the right direction, the larger crowd you gather in front of you, the more you can influence the conversation. You can change the behavior, you can raise awareness, and you can establish market share and build evangelists, and ideally make the world a better place. So let's see if that's what we got. So hopefully this gave you enough to be slightly dangerous, but also have questions and know that you have a resource, and we're very happy to talk folks through what can be deep water and become deep water very quickly. So with that, if there are any questions, I'd be happy to entertain those. Oh.
Yeah, so what you just said is more about when the company is more established. But my question is, what did Airbnb and Uber, this kind of company, do when they just got started? Got started to acquire customers and users?
So acquisition is a byproduct of awareness. So this is where, and we're in such an interesting time and space where you can slice your audience about 1,000 different ways by platform and by outlet. So you can be very strategic depending on your technology about where you go to find media and public relations. So if your technology, for example, is in the shared space, there are outlets, not unlike GeekWire or Technology, where you can try and find placements in that area. So being strategic about your approach, knowing that you have limited resources, and you can also leverage individual stories in your company. So they may have taken one of those 4 approaches. What's our technology? How much can we be a disruptor in this technology? And then sharing that story out through either starting small and then building larger. Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay.
Can I do a follow-up?
Yeah.
So I heard a story about this start of Airbnb, they just do in-person marketing and to like just install apps on cell phones. They go to like conferences.
Oh, really?
Do you think that's a good idea?
I think what you can't undervalue, and we touch on this a little bit, and I think it was written down, but I didn't mention it, the power of word of mouth. And this will be your drumbeat as you move forward, is how can you empower people to just talk about your product? And that's a guerrilla marketing technique. I think there's a lot of interest and ingenuity in the guerrilla marketing world. And what's interesting there is if it's been done once, it's difficult to recreate that buzz if it's done a second time. So if that's a tactic you're interested in pursuing, you kind of have to find the next evolution in it. So instead of conferences, maybe it's mall food courts. You know, so how can you iterate on a good idea and make it better, but also make sure you're kind of aware of the cautionary tale, the letter S, make sure it's new.
Thanks.
Yeah.
So for being startups, like these are all rather large companies with all
Yeah.
own media departments.
Yeah.
How do you, in interacting with startups, how much time have you seen people spend on it that's been worthwhile? Like
Yeah.
when
Oh, exactly.
pivoting, just to make sure I get more specific, like pivoting, and then also like for doing the launch, like have you found that it's good to do everything like as you go along, like continually growing, or like to a real hard launch? So I guess it's two separate questions.
Okay.
How much time do you spend on it, and have you found that like startups, it's best to kind of like slow build, keep going, like hoping it permeates, or to just launch, like hard launch and just like try to permeate the market?
Okay, so it's going to depend on your technology a little bit, and then where you are in your maturity level as a company. So if you are fully baked, if you're like, this is we're going to market, this is the product, our percent chance of iteration is low, it's a hard launch. If you're like, you know, we believe we have 60% of the concept fleshed, then it's going to be an iterative launch. So I think there's a little bit of both. And do we need a microphone when we, okay, great. How much time to spend? That's the magic question, right? So how much can you devote? And I was hoping that with kind of my MVP approach, that'd give you like, all right, let's create a presence. Because you know as soon as you start generating awareness, the first thing people will do is search you, right? And they're going to check to see how big of a footprint you have, which will lead them to rightly or wrongly presume reputation. You know, this is how big these guys walk. So I think as you approach launch, where you go with time you spend on your outreach, media, and communication will increase exponentially.
So you said they will search around. You don't want me to follow. You said they'll
Yeah.
search around. Have you found good ways to try to launch or like lay seeds quietly, so it doesn't like you don't burn out
Right.
your launch too quick? It's like you're laying these around like little time bombs, so that way when you do launch and people do that search, they see that you've been around for a little while, but you haven't like already scorched the earth with what you're trying to do.
No, and I love the scorched earth analogy. Yes, we've done publications where we've pushed websites and web pages and not published, but not publicized those pages. So we've just kind of kept them darker. Or orphan pages work pretty nicely too. That way you can kind of just flick the switch and work on it that way. And then you can, you know, and I've done this with journalists before, but you can definitely plant seeds with journalists about upcoming ideas and just pique interest without having to have the story fully fleshed out at that point. Jerry.
Yeah, thanks. So we've got kind of an odd business in that it's specialty instruments. It's not general public. It's not Uber. It's not a general consumer product.
Yeah.
And we know the 3,000 people who might buy it.
Yeah.
We know all of them. So
Are any of them in the room or watching right now?
No.
Okay. Otherwise, we could do some work right now.
We
Yeah.
can sell you an X-ray instrument. How does that, when you have that kind of bottom-up ability to do marketing, how does that influence the routes that you might want to take for PR?
Yeah, I love that. So the question, just in case folks didn't hear, because I think it's really a very excellent question, and applies in one scale or another to almost every product idea, is you have a finite number of people, you know them or can reach them pretty succinctly. How do you market to them? You, I'm going to guess, have a competitor.
At present, we don't.
You have a pretty good position. But you also then would have to break habit. You'd also then have to convince and ask people to take a risk, right? That's going to be a big issue. So, and we've done work in this space, but you need to build credibility and then project that credibility through testimonial to these folks. And there's ways, and we can talk offline about how that's best achieved, but that's a game plan we've seen work before. And then I think the key, and some businesses don't know this, but who's your decision maker? Who's going to say yes? And if you know that, you're pretty far away.
Yeah. We had a discussion yesterday with our first sale where it turned out that someone we knew had asked them, well, as soon as you get your machine, can you test the sample?
Yeah.
And the person making the request is the decision maker at a totally different institution, where the people under them don't want to invest time in researching the product until they know the decision maker is going to buy.
Right.
The decision maker won't buy until the people under them.
Yep.
So yeah, we're running into this decision maker issue very crisply, and the combined decision maker credibility issues very crisply.
Yeah. Bruce and I are working on a client now who has some water technology that they have that same question with. Like, all right, we need to have sales to generate sales, and we need to have proof of performance. So there's that chicken egg a little bit, but it's an active fate. But it's a fascinating equation, and we've worked on it before.
Yeah, I'm wondering about, so in our startup, we have limited time.
Right, and money.
But I'm wondering about how you guys recommend how you measure what you're doing, the effects of what you're doing. So, like, for example, your slide with the article, and it's like you buy the bigger fish,
Yeah.
fish. Even if you can get into Wired, how are you measuring, like, what effect that's having? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
your key performance indicators are going.
Oh, yeah.
How do you know how much of what you're doing is really,
Yeah.
how do you know that, like, what you're working on is really effective or not?
Yeah, measuring success, right? So there are about 4 metrics in the communications world. Well, 4 significant metrics. And unlike Jerry, a lot of us have competitors. So you'll want to look at share of voice. You know, how much are folks talking about your product or your idea or your concept versus every other concept? And that's a fixed metric that you can track, right? And then, you know, the 2 slides that we had, what could go wrong, what could go right, that's an example of sentiment. So we also work in a very controversial space sometimes. So sentiment is a gauge that we use, how many positive articles, how many negative articles, and then you can track that. And then there's also reach. So and that was at 2 million, 28 million. And then attached with reach typically is a publicity value. So how much would it have cost you to place that article? So those are the 4 metrics that we tend to focus on.
So that was helpful.
Yeah.
With the negative articles, can you talk a little bit about damage control and, like, having statements ready for, like,
Yeah.
something bad is written by a company and they call? What do you think about this?
Yeah. And this is, so crisis communications, reputational management. That was a slide where we looked at, you know, these huge companies that are valued at more than $1 trillion combined. Terrible things have happened at Disney, with Disney. And there's several keys to it. One, we worked through crisis communications planning before, and it's a little Hollywood, because you're going to try and find scenarios you believe could go wrong and identify those ahead of time. And I know the startup world is very much like a campaign, and we work in the political space quite a bit. So there is that, like, you can only have 3, right? So you can do it well, you know, that whole. So you want to have a little forward thought to it. the worst case scenario is to pick up the phone, have a text, get an email, or even worse, once you have social properties, have a tweet sent towards you, and you're not monitoring. And then 12 hours later, this company was not responsive to our media request. So there's a little bit of activism on your part to think ahead about how this X-ray machine might go sideways, or how your company could go wrong. And then, this is the DIY, do it with you. Reach out to resources, because you'll need to have typically prepared statements, just so you're not running that fire drill as it's occurring. And that's why fire drills are run. So when there's a fire, you know what to do. So unfortunately, there's an investment to it. But it's amazing how quickly that pays off day of.
So looking at the time, I think we have time for one more question. David, you want to?
So here's a question. I'm working with a startup. We don't even have 3,000 customers. We have 10. And the product is extremely far from sexy because it's highly technical.
Mm-hmm.
But it cuts the cost of operations for these companies by a factor of 10.
Yeah.
How do I get into GeekWire?
Well, the question is, do you need GeekWire? If you have 10 customers, and I think you hit a really important point. What are those 10 customers reading? What influences those 10 customers? So some research into who these people are, because now you have your targets, right? What are the leverage points for those targets? And sometimes it's influence building. There's how can you reach the people who influence them? So suddenly there's a slightly wider network. And if the people surrounding those 10 decision makers subscribe to GeekWire or Business Insider or Forbes, you kind of know your target, and that's, there are thousands of publications, right? So that's your battle. But we can I'm sure there's some nuance to that, but we can definitely talk offline. And we do encourage you to shoot us an email. So my email address is up there, and Anna and Bruce, who are in the room, and Alex, who might be watching live stream, are available, and it's Bruce G and Anna B at Gallatin, PA. So we definitely encourage you to take part in that resource, and we'll be around a little bit if there are any additional questions.
Well, thank you so much, Eric. So next up we have the Entrepreneurial Law Clinic. They will, so we'll take a 10-minute break, and then they will be talking about raising capital. And so stay around for that. There's more questions back, so help yourself. And then we will come back around a little after 1 o'clock to start that next session. So thank you. Yeah. Did you need to?
Well, no, we
muted already. Right?
Hello?
Yeah. Testing? Testing?
Yours will need to go up a little bit.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so let's do that.
Testing? 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 I don't think this is on. The light
No,
is.
it is.
Oh, is it? Oh, okay. I
Yeah,
didn't see
yeah,
that.
yeah,
Okay. All right. Testing? Testing?
Testing,
Okay.
testing.
Perfect. Perfect. All right.
Should we keep it on?
I would
Unmute
unmute.
or-
I would unmute it.
Let me just
Hello?
make sure. Yep, perfect. Perfect.
Right?
Well, thank you all for coming back, and so we're going to get it started right now. I know, how exciting. Yes. Okay, I love it. This is the best subject, right? How do we actually raise money? What is capital raising? So we have the Entrepreneurial Law Clinic students here today to tell us more about, raising capital. So I'll let Cheryl and Dennis take it from here.
Great. Good afternoon. Delightful to be here. I don't know how to raise money. The topic is raising capital, so we'll see how far we get into there. My name is Cheryl Lee, and with my co-presenter, Dennis Kasimov, we are third-year law students in the Entrepreneurial Law program at the University of Washington Law School. And at this moment, I'd like to actually acknowledge and thank our supervising attorney, Chris Koa. Chris, wave!
Thank you,
There.
Chris.
With Dorsey and Whitney, and he's been instrumental in helping us put together the contents of this slide. So before I even get into the next slide, just a way of introduction, I've had a few careers before coming to law school. And I've been an engineer. I've also have obtained my MBA, and I've helped raise funds for within VCs, worked for a VC, helped put a couple business plans together, did business and marketing, but I don't think I've done many of these. So now that we're in law school, and this is within the context of law school clinic, I have to say that the contents that we are presenting this afternoon is really information only, and it does not constitute legal advice. So if you have any specific questions to your company, please consult an attorney.
Our lawyers told us to say this.
Just need to say it. And so we'll get into the roadmap. Again, having been in VC and worked with startups, raising capital is exciting, it's challenging. You could go on. To pack this in within a half an hour presentation is like almost impossible, but we'll see what we can do. At a high level, touch on sources of capital and the relevant applicable laws, as well as some of the instruments and the common types of investments, and what are some of the provisions that I think a lot of you entrepreneurs should be aware of, and then the various funding stages and deal specifics. As I said, we will be covering a lot of content. If there is one slide that you're going to leave with, I hope, and I see some nodding, thank you for the affirmation, that please, do not sell an ownership stake in your company without first consulting a lawyer. I also know a lot of horror stories, and I think you will also hear it as you go through your path in your journey. So these are some of the common sources of capital. I think many of you all know everything from your own personal savings. Early stage investors, we call this seed stage. Venture capitals, we have friends and family who may loan you money, those are seed as well, as angels who use their own money, and many of the angels are also former serial entrepreneurs as well. And then we have these super angels who also invest, have a portfolio of a couple hundred companies as well, startups. So they're very active in this area, and they're sometimes giving the VCs a run for their money as well. Incubators, CoMotion is an incubator here, but some accelerators, they give a little bit of seed money, and then they take a small equity. VCs, I think many of you know, they take institutional fund, high-end funds, create a fund, and invest in startups that really show, tremendous potential for growth. Just for my understanding of the entrepreneurs, or those of you who are thinking or who have companies, how many of you have engaged or received seed funding or angel funding, angel investment? Okay. VCs? Okay. It's pretty much personal funds, friends and family? Okay, so, okay, that's good. I just wanted to, crowdfunding? Anybody use that source? Okay, Great. So we'll touch on those. Some of these materials may be too elemental for you, but again, I just wanted to make sure that we touched as broadly as possible, not without getting too detailed.
Thank you. All right, well, we're going to go in a little bit of detail into the actual sources first. As you mentioned, a lot of companies start out just bootstrapping with the founder's own money, and generally there's no securities regulatory issues, there's no current tax issues, and this is obviously the easiest way of funding, but you can't fund your company forever this way. Yeah.
So
we can't take questions.
Yeah, can we take questions at the end just so that we finish? Thank you.
So going next to a hot topic, receiving gifts from friends and family, and you're generally safe as long as they have no expectation of receiving a ownership stake for this gift that they're giving you, and they don't expect to share in the profits in any way. And usually, it would be best to document this in writing so that the IRS or any other agencies do not classify it as a non-interest loan. And you're safe from gift taxes up to about the giver is safe from gift taxes up to about $14,000. So, no.
Could you move just a little bit this way?
Can I? Sorry about that. Okay. Now, selling securities, this is where you start running into issues. Securities generally means just an investment. It can cover a broad range of things, debt and equity, the most high-level securities. It's selling securities, aka an ownership stake, or receiving a loan is highly regulated by the SEC, and you need to watch out. You need to consult a lawyer, like was mentioned by Cheryl earlier. And the applicable laws and regulations, they really broadly define security, so a lot of things can be lumped in under there. Loan and debt and loans are also securities. So watch out for this as well. Taking bank loans, even a loan from a friend will be a security. So moving into applicable laws, just first the applicable laws, the most pertinent ones are promulgated by the Securities and Exchange Commission. They're a federal agency and the responsibility for enforcing everything. A little historical context. All these laws that we're going to talk about today, they were created after the Great Depression as a means to protect investors from fraud and misrepresentation. And they seek to do this through requiring the registration of securities that the company wants to sell to the public. And the idea is that through registration, you provide the SEC with information, and the investors can make an informed decision whether they want to buy this or take on the risk. However, registration is highly expensive and prohibitively expensive in a lot of cases. So a lot of companies, especially startups, cannot do this. So the SEC has created a number of exceptions to registration that allow startups to raise money. And all these, the main exceptions are contained in Regulation D, it's called. So these are the simplest, the most common, the basic safe harbor rules. And the most popular by far is 506B. About 90% of fundraising that happens underneath Regulation D happens through 506B, and we'll get to there soon. So a little bit of terminology before we go through these rules. Accredited investor basically just means rich person, richer person. This should say or, but and then sophisticated investor refers to how experienced they are in business and investing matters. And there's private firms that kind of aggregate these people, and they give them tests, and they can inform them. They basically a vetting process that companies can go to and find investors that way. So the first one, Rule 504, it's not very popular because of the funding limit. It's only $1 million. I guess if there's any positives, that it doesn't limit the amount of accredited or non-accredited investors. However, if you do sell to accredited investors, there's a lot of disclosure requirements, and disclosure requirements are basically equal to registering your securities. So it's not, there's not too many pluses with using this rule. And the other is it does, there are exceptions, there are a few exceptions to general solicitation that it provides. 505, it raises the funding limit a little bit more. There's still a prohibition on general solicitations. And sorry, I meant in the terminology slide, general solicitation is basically you're finding investors that you had no prior business relationship with before. You're posting on your website, you're making cold calls, and these rules, except for a couple exceptions in 504, prohibit that. 506B, by far the most common exception. There's no dollar limit. You can get an unlimited amount of accredited investors, rich investors, and up to 35 sophisticated non-accredited. But most businesses that I've seen, they just stick with soliciting accredited investors to be safe. Once again, no general advertisement or solicitation. They must be specifically targeted to people you've had business relationships with in the past. And a huge plus for this law is that it preempts any state securities laws. So there's only one level of securities laws that you need to deal with if you qualify for this exemption. Just a quick slide for a primer, or just so you guys know the issue. There are federal securities laws under the SEC, and there's also state securities laws. If you qualify for 506B, no need to worry about the blue sky laws. The other ones, though, you do. Cheryl.
Great. I think the takeaway there is it's complex. There's a lot of regulations there, and again, it can be one of the dry kind of topic areas, but it's really, really critical that you do find the right folks to advise you as you begin engaging in terms of raising funds. Very much aware these are some of the instruments for investors when you are selling a stake in your company in return for some funds. Common stock, I think most of you are very familiar with. Stock trading on the New York Stock Exchange. Most of you, when you find your company, you start with shares of common stock and then also use it to bring in employees if you don't have the money to hire them at a going rate. I think you know the upsides and the downsides as well. Preferred stock, this one is definitely typically for investors that are interested in investing in your company. In essence of time, requires a valuation of your company. So, depending on what stage the company is in, there's going to be a lot of negotiations that will be going back and forth between the investor and you, the entrepreneur. My company's worth more than that, and the investor saying, oh no, it's worth this. So that's an ongoing negotiation. But there are some also key, there's a lot of contracts and paperwork that has to be signed and negotiated and agreed upon between the company and the investors, especially VCs. Also, several important provisions that are part of preferred stock. One is liquidation. Again, if basically the company liquidates for whatever reasons, the preferred stocks have higher priority than common stocks. The investors will look for anti-dilution provisions. So basically, at the amount of money that they invested in per share price, they don't want it to be going down in subsequent rounds of fundings. Also, let's see. No voting rights. You don't have voting rights to vote for directors, but some investors will also negotiate veto rights. And also, it's conversion to common stock if majority of the shareholders vote to convert and there is a lucrative sale or IPO.
I think the most important thing to note about preferred stock is it's a creature of contract and it's highly negotiable.
Convertible notes, generally this is used in the early stage seed. Somebody said you got some angel investment, so probably this was maybe one of the instruments that was used. Some of the preferences or provisions there, again, it has, in terms of the preference at liquidation, it's higher than preferred and common. Some of there is no need for valuation. Again, this is very convenient because when you're starting out, how do you value a company where you're still trying to figure out the idea and the prototypes and whatnot? One of the provisions that investors will look for is a valuation cap. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but basically it's not a valuation on the company, but it's the cap on what the company would be valued at the next round of funding. So for example, if the cap is $3 million, then at the next round of funding, the let's say VC valued your company at $6 million. That means basically your note that you convert into stocks basically would be almost double than what you have, what the subsequent investors got it at. Discount rate, again, investors that come in at an early stage are basically taking on a lot of risk, and so they need to be rewarded for that risk. And so let's say with a 20% discount rate, if angel investor comes in and the stock is valued, say, excuse me, at $1, I'm trying to talk too fast here, at $1, then with your discount rate of 20%, basically you could buy that one share for 80 cents. I think, so I hope I'm not going into too much details that you already know. I just wanted to touch it. And then again, as I said, it is a note. It comes with a principal and a interest that accrues, and then when whatever the triggering point may be, a subsequent financing round or acquisition or IPO, the convertible note converts into shares, stock of the company. SAFE, again, is something that, like Y Combinator, something that came in, but it's really same as a convertible note, except there's no principal or no accruing interest. It's just it converts into shares at a subsequent round of funding. Crowdfunding. This is something that I also have many friends who've used it, and some of them have been very successful. But there are, again, a lot of issues to be mindful of. There's federal and state laws, and then also the laws are quite recent, so it's still evolving a little bit, I would say. But really, for equity, we open it up to anyone to invest. It is an intensive and expensive process. You do have to go through a broker or a funding portal, so that can also be, again, intensive and expensive process. There are strict funding limitations for how much the company can raise through this mechanism, as well as also individual investors. So as you can see, for the company, it's about maximum of $1 million over 12 months. And then for the individual investors, not more than $100,000 per year. The VC community, for the most part, at least the folks that I know, are actually a little bit weary about this, because instead of having few investors, when it comes time for to execute on your exit strategy, and you have a lot of investors there, every single one of them, they have to do the due diligence. So there's a little bit of weariness there, but again, it's still at the early stages.
And there are also people you don't know. They're strangers and you haven't dealt with.
That's true. And then there's the popular one, Kickstarter. I've also invested in a few of those as well. Again, there's no equity. Whatever you invest, you either get a piece of the product or whatnot. And so far, because you're not selling securities, at least in terms of the regulatory issues, there doesn't appear to be a problem. And in terms of, and this is just another extension of the rule in general solicitation, there's another rule, 506C, and with respect to, under the umbrella of, I guess, crowdfunding, it gets rid of the prohibition on like general solicitation, but in essence, what it does is that you can only solicit verified and accredited investors. And so basically, they have to be verified as accredited investor. And the upside of that is that once you have the target pool that you verify, there is no limit to the investment and to the funding. So that's the upside.
Can I say the thing about the local?
Yeah.
There's actually, if you guys know McNanamans, it's a local chain franchise. They've actually used this 506C recently to raise money, and they did a general solicitation on their website. And so a lot of people have been wary of this because they're afraid of you have to reasonably be assured that they're accredited investors. So it might be a huge turnoff for some companies, but it just shows that if you have a competent counsel and you go on it, you take advantage, you read the regulations that the SEC promulgates, you can take advantage of this rule.
I think most startups know this, but just wanted to actually give you a little break from all the black text. So that's the only reason I put this on here, okay? Just to give you a little break from all the black text here. But really, this is a typical of the stages that we look at in terms of startup companies, from ideas to proof of concept, and on. And then really the rounds of funding from C to generally VCs, generally I say, come in at Series A, B, and then sometimes some of the companies take bridge loans, financing, and as well as some may or may not go into C and beyond. Some go into D. And then in terms of the fundings, as well as types of investors that kind of play into each of those series with respect to progress of your startup. And so seed financing generally, again, at the end of the idea stage, led by angel investors, and those are some of the investments used. I think convertible notes are probably most commonly used there. Series A financing round, again, led by VCs. What we typically see about VCs is like, they're tough. They have a lot of tough negotiation and a lot of agreements, but they also have the task of going out there and raising funds, to be able to invest. So that in itself is a challenge. I think that's something that most people don't see about VCs. But again, when you start dealing with the VCs for investments, requires company valuation. Bridge financing, again, it's a convertible note that is frequently used by later stage companies. For example, if you could just infuse a little bit of money now so that maybe the valuation at the next round can jump, that's an opportunity to do that. Or if the company's distressed, then you need an infusion of cash to get you to that next round. So this is a tool, instrument used. With respect to all of these types of investment mechanism and looking at raising fund, I think it's also really important to keep the term due diligence in mind. When you are looking at executing on your exit strategy, obviously whether it's an acquisition or IPO, tremendous due diligence is going to happen on the investors, the capital distribution of the company, all of that. So again, it's really important to keep all of the investments, the records as clean as possible, because one way or another, if you are going to be wildly successful, as I think you will be, due diligence is going to be a critical component of really reaping the rewards of your hard work. Also, investors. A lot of times we want money, we need cash. I think I heard somebody earlier at the end of the presentation, man, we need money, so we grow. But it's also important that we're also, I say we because I was part of the investment community or startup community, but I think it's also important that the entrepreneurs do due diligence on the investors as well. Find out, well, what is their motivation? Why are they investing in my company or in this area? And also, what is their reputation? Because if you have somebody who probably doesn't have a very good reputation invest in your earlier round, that may have implications for your subsequent rounds, because other folks may say, oh, that person invested, forget it, I'm staying away. It's just human nature. So things to watch out for. And it is real, it happens out there. So again, and then also, due diligence, say, wait a minute, in addition to money, what else can I get from this investor? Like, what are the contacts, right? And what are the doors that he or she or this firm can open for us? So again, just keep due diligence in mind.
And just a couple endpoints specific to an actual financing. We had a lot more, but we shortened it up. First of all, I just wanted to familiarize you guys with a capitalization table, and it's just, I'm sure most of you already know what it is. It's the record of your shareholders and their ownership percentages. Just some terminology. Post-money valuation is basically valuation of your company after you receive the funding, and pre-money is just that number minus the investment. And the reason I put value in quotes is because it's important to know that not to live and die by this number. It is not the true valuation of your company at the time. Like if a buyer was coming in and to purchase you at that time, they would likely not pay this. This is just a cursory valuation given to you by a VC firm for the purpose of discovery, for the purpose of calculating the percent ownerships. And so their valuation analysis is a lot simpler than what a legitimate buyer would do in that time. This is just a very, very simple capitalization table, shares, your pre-money value, post-money. And one last point is early on, don't get discouraged because that you might get a lower valuation than you might have hoped for. Or don't even, shoot to the stars with your business, but don't necessarily shoot to the stars with your valuation. A huge valuation at the beginning does not mean good. It's not necessarily a good thing, because the more conservative you are, the more you can keep expectations reasonable, and you will avoid down rounds, which is subsequent financing rounds that are actually, the shares are sold for less than they were sold at the previous round. And this triggers a lot of dilution concerns and unhappy investors. And and that is it. Here's the clinic's information. Thank you very much for listening. Any questions?
we flew through that presentation. I flew that presentation because there's just a lot to cover there. But if there's clarification areas or if you have questions, please ask.
Could you put up your safe investing slide?
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry. That was my bored but fun slide.
I just wanted to read it.
Yeah.
Okay.
So basically, it is same as a convertible debt. This was made popular by like Y Combinator and them. And instead of like negotiating what the interest rate on the principal was going to be and what the maturity date was going to be, I mean, they knew it was going to be converting to equity later on. So basically, move that out and then just work on the conversion terms.
You mentioned in the earlier round you want to also do due diligence as an investor. And besides the bad reputation, say that person is not likable, what are some of the real damages they can cause? And can you manage those risks by like putting in like a contract that what they cannot do to mitigate those risks?
So contract issues, I can't address because that's, I think, a bit of a legal advice, but I can speak to the business side. So the question was, do due diligence on the early investors, not only about bad reputation, but what else can you do in terms of mitigating some of the risks? I think, again, I think you've, in these presentations, heard a lot about networking. I think the startup community is pretty tight, pretty closely knit. So find out, get as much insight as you possibly can about that investor, because I think if you hear about somebody, I'm sorry to use the word screwing over a company, it's going to get out there. Again, so continue to be really good at what you're doing and excel and execute your own company, but also network with the startup community so that you do have that news out there. I have many friends who have started and taken some companies public or sold 3 or 4 companies, and by the second or third time, people know. Everybody knows the place. So really network and really get out there in the community and also expose yourself. I mean, there's a lot of other factors you can, but I think the reputation in the community about how they are perceived, as well as what they have done or not done to their previous investment, I think is a good, at least a state for you to, assess. I hope it helped. Yeah.
So we're manufacturers, and we're going to hit recurring cash flow bumps, the cash flow trouble, each time we get a major order.
Mm-hmm.
So is that time for convertible note after convertible note? Is there a way to do a Kickstarter thing where people, I'll use the wrong terms, buy shares in the eventual outcome of the sale and get their investment back that way? How can we think about funding on a small, 5 orders a year? How do you handle that kind of bump?
I'm going to just repeat the question, and then you could answer that. No, because I think some people are streaming here. So the question was, in a manufacturing a company where you are strapped for cash based on your cycles of fulfilling manufacturing demand, fulfilling orders, right? Then, what are some of the instruments you use to raise the necessary cash? So is it convertible debt? Is it loan? Or how do you do it? So that was the question.
Sure. And Chris, stop me if I start going too much into legal advice.
We're technically not lawyers.
I mean, it just sounds like you need little influxes of cash to keep you going in between major stages.
Buying the pieces as soon as the order comes in.
Buying the pieces.
Buying the components that will be assembled. Yeah.
Okay. So
Cash for cost of goods sold.
then,
What she said.
Yeah.
okay. I mean, then you could focus on convertible notes. Debt financing would probably be your best. With bridge financing, we had a slide on. Like we have the general solicitation rule that will allow you to find investors that you might not have a prior relationship with, as Rule 506C if you want to learn more about it.
I just may add a little bit on that. Again, I think, and I'm going to go back because I do bring in my business background as well as legal confines, I call it. Again, within your business plans, where are you? Because again, some of these convertible notes, depending on how you negotiate it, it's converting into shares of your company. So really have to have that big picture. I know when it comes to cash flow, like, I need to make it over this order, right? So that I can make it big, right? I need to drive the sales now so that I could get that next sales. And so it's like feeding into it. But what is really important is for, I think, the entrepreneur to sit down and have this kind of the big picture, like where is this taking me? And then also, depending on how confident you are and where you think you're going to be, like, am I also comfortable giving up shares of my company, right? At the end of the day, I mean, nothing's free. I've heard in Econ 101, there's no free lunch. So depending on how you use it, if you think that you're going to be okay, then maybe like, bridge loans, maybe an option, I don't know. But again, I don't think there is like, oh, this is it. Again, it depends on where you're taking your business, what your appetite is for how much you are willing to give up. And again, the intricacies of that negotiation is a whole new story as well.
And to go off Cheryl's point of think about how much, if you were going to use a convertible note, you do need to think about how much of your company you would want to give up. And there's a lot of horror stories about, really pay attention to the valuation cap and the discount rate that the VCs or the investors will ask for. Generally, they're going to play nice because it is a tight-knit community, but they have taken advantage of entrepreneurs that are not aware of these issues, and they end up taking a much larger chunk in the end, or have a much larger liquidation preference. But
I have a question that's kind of related to convertible notes. Are valuation caps something that are always expected for those, or are they negotiable? Do they depend on the investors? Is that something that the startup company puts out, or is this a conversation that happens? Can they not happen?
I mean, of course, like if you put it in the contract, generally though, they're there, and it's a way of, so to speak, rewarding the investor for helping you out early on or at the time that you need money, because it basically, with the valuation cap, it basically ensures that that investor will have a certain amount of equity when it converts. So
quite frankly, if you're the entrepreneur, right, you basically you want to make sure that the cap is as high as possible, right, and the investor wants it as low as possible. So you got that tug of war going on.
Is there a strategic way of doing that, or do you suggest one after you've started a conversation, or do you approach them with a valuation cap?
So the question is, what's the strategy in terms of negotiating a valuation cap with an investor? I don't think there is one approach. Yeah, it really depends on, where you are, what stage you are in the company, what kind of amazing, what major breakthroughs have you had, what do you have in the pipeline. So really, it all depends on your negotiation tools and what you bring to the table in terms of negotiating with that investor.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks. I have another question.
Go ahead. I like the questions.
The question is if to satisfy the registration exceptions, whether you apply for them or you just passively look if you satisfy the requirements. And you file a document called the Form D with the SEC. Chris?
So for the $14,000 that you can get gifts from friends and family, does it matter whether it's given to you or to the company? So if my uncle Bill Gates gives me $14,000.
Oh, you're saying like if they give $14K to the company and then $14K to you?
Yeah, does it matter who they give it to?
That I can't say for sure.
Chris, do you know?
That's really a federal income tax question, but I believe it's an individual to another individual.
Okay.
I believe.
That's why we have him here.
Oh.
Go ahead.
So it's a pretty technical question. So what kind of insurance does Uber buy for its drivers, and how does the taxation works inside? Like, does Uber file the taxation for its drivers, or just they file it themselves?
Okay, so let me repeat your question. So what kind of insurance does Uber buy for their drivers?
Yeah.
So my understanding is Uber's drivers are independent contractors. They're not Uber's employees.
Depends on the state.
Is it? Does it? So yeah, but in terms of taxation, I know nothing about tax, so I'm sorry I cannot answer tax question.
Yeah, it seems a little out of the scope, but generally if they're contractors, they'll file their own, and then if they're employees, Uber will file half.
doing work for it,
Mm-hmm.
do I have to pay myself the minimum employee wage?
You know, the safe thing to do is yes, and this is actually an issue that's coming up with my client this quarter, because they're federally at the minimum wage. There's an exception for employees that own 20% of a company, but Washington State does not have, to my knowledge, that same exception. So the safe thing to do would be to pay yourself, or because the state just wants its payroll tax chunk, right? So like you don't necessarily have to pay yourself. Well, I feel like I'm going too much into advice, or like.
And this might be beyond the scope of it, what you can do from one state to another. So maybe we just talked about some big deal. But is there a way to structure it part-time? Because that's the concern, like, that I'm thinking about. The more that I have to pay myself the minimum wage, like, how do I structure that minimum wage so that way I satisfy, like, the payroll tax, but I'm not draining my ACO funds?
Do you want to take my email down, and when I finish my memo for this quarter's client, I'll send it to you as well.
But keep in mind, nothing prevents you from continuing to invest your own funds into your company. Right?
Yeah, no.
Yeah. Lincoln?
So you guys have free legal. I just checked the website. So
Oh,
you guys
good. You
offer-
checked the Entrepreneurial Law Clinic. Let's
Yeah.
get that up there.
Yeah, so you guys offer free legal service every quarter.
So Entrepreneurial Law Clinic is headed up by Professor Jennifer Fan. She's a director back there, so she's here. She's the one who coordinated with Elizabeth to put these series on. So it's a great opportunity for students to work with supervising attorneys to get some practice. Yes, we do have students in the Entrepreneurial Law Clinic. I believe we have about 18 this quarter. It's a highly select group of students. So the ones of us standing here, we're a very highly select group of students. Thank you. It's highly competitive, and so, but we do have an application. There are certain requirements that entrepreneurs do need to meet to qualify. But yes, students do work with clients. We help with like corporation entity incorporation. So whether you're going to be a C Corp, S Corp, LLC, the students meet with you and understand what your needs are and work with supervising attorneys to come up with recommendations. Also intellectual property. We also partner with the USPTO, and so students that are focusing on patent or hardcore IP law, we have students who have filed on behalf of the clients as well. Again, there are qualifiers to be able to be eligible to participate in this, but yes. And most of us students have new clients every quarter that we work with.
Okay, so can we just get free legal advice if we qualify, or you guys have to select? What's the criteria?
So the question is, can we apply and receive automatic legal advice, or is there a selection, and what is the criteria for selection? So we do have more applicants than the students that will be able to assist the folks that are interested in receiving assistance through the program. So, but there are certain requirements, and I don't know, Professor Penn, if you wanted to address that, or maybe it is, so depending on your situation, we do have the application. If you go through the application, there are a lot of questions that it does asks, and so based on the responses to that application, the clinic makes a decision on which of the clients would be qualified for this program.
And there's one last question, just looking at time. I think that we have time for one more. Does anyone else have another question?
I could talk to you more after this. Yeah. Final?
Final question? Awesome. Well,
All
thank
right.
you both so
Great.
much. We really
Thank
appreciate
you.
it.
Thank you.
So if you guys do have individual